Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day it is where you're watching this. My name is Daniel Ludvigson. I'm presently the superintendent of Long Prairie Gray Eagle, and this is Dual Administrative Roles. What is it like? The last 10 years, I've been a dual role administrator in North Dakota. I had 5 years as both the elementary principal and superintendent, and another 5 as K-12 building principal, and really like a part-time superintendent because the superintendent I worked on had a very part-time schedule. He spent a lot of time where he wasn't there. Good administrator, but added to the duties. And when you work in a small town, wearing multiple hats is not uncommon, but sometimes it can take on a comically long list. So mine, when I was a K-12 principal, was a K-12 principal, art teacher, transportation coordinator, MTSS coordinator, 504 coordinator, power school data manager, and my personal favorite, pop machine coordinator. People didn't always understand when I didn't share their feelings about the importance of that last job title. I guess sometimes when you're thirsty, you want to drink right away. So with that, remember to have a little bit of humor with this, as I always think that is a good thing to have. So why would a school consider a dual role administrative position? Also, why would you consider it as an individual that might be filling that role? Districts, for the most part, the biggest reason is generally cost savings. Human capital can be a reason right behind there. So obviously it is cheaper to have less administrators, as they tend to be your highest paid staff. And they tend to be your most trained, not always, but finding people who fit those trainings, have that educational background, can be difficult, particularly in today's job market, where pretty much every educational position is in some sort of shortage, particularly those of us who teach in rural areas of the United States. There are just not as many people to go around. So sometimes it's easier to combine a position with somebody that you know is pretty competent, rather than go looking for another candidate. Sometimes you have a administrator leave late in the hiring season. Maybe they leave in late June, late July, and your chances of finding a quality candidate just aren't that good. Declining numbers is often a reason that kind of relates to the cost saving, but a lot of times if the district's in declining enrollment, you end up in situations where you really reevaluate. It's the workload decreasing, our costs, is our revenue decreasing, and therefore we need to cut costs. Is the amount of work that position needs to do the same? And I add lack of understanding as a caveat here, because one of the interesting parts in particular with principal and superintendent positions is that people do not always understand what we do. So keep in mind with that, sometimes people like to ask questions about, like, do we really need a superintendent? They're paid an awful lot of money. Do we really need a principal? What do they really do? Are they necessary? Obviously, I would argue that they are necessary, but that might be a thought process. So pause on this slide for a moment and think about the activity. Write 2 things that you already know about a dual role administrator and 2 questions that you think this presentation will answer. Take a moment, and then we'll proceed and read that report there. It is a survey from South Dakota, but relevant to us in the Midwest. All right, let's continue on with the presentation. So what are the pros of a dual role administrator? What are the cons? I'll start with the pros. As you can see here, I have a few more cons, but I'm not against this sort of thing by any means. I did it for 10 years. But one obvious pro is that it's cheaper. It's both cheaper in cost and in human capital, as you see there. It might be easier to find one good quality candidate, as you want your administrators to be effective and to be very good at what they do. So it might be easier to find one than to bring on 2 where one is weak or maybe not a very good fit, so that you're not just hiring whoever is out there. So that might be a possible reason. As an administrator, you have a wider breadth of involvement in the school. As you saw with my, when I was K-12 principal, I was in the classroom, I taught, I was interacting with students, I was working with bus routes and schedules. So that gave me a pretty wide knowledge about how my district was operating, how different things interact, how things got along, things that needed tweaking. So I had a pretty wide knowledge base, and I really understood what people had to do a lot more than if I didn't necessarily have those duties to complete. And because of that breadth of involvement, I had a lot of hands-on knowledge with different aspects. Like I personally got the power school there up and running, so I knew how that worked on the backside. I knew quite a bit about reporting and the amount of time those things would take. So I was seen in a lot of different places, and by being in a lot of different places, I got a knowledge on a wide variety of things. You could say a jack of all trades and a master of none, which generally describes this sort of combination pretty well. Some of the cons are I would really recommend that it be a strong administrator, or at least somebody very strong in time management. I'll get more into that later, but it's not a great position to be in when you're trying to learn the position new, as there is a lot to it, a lot of different moving parts, and you have to learn a lot broader range of topics and be knowledgeable in a lot broader range of things. And so if you have an administrator that's inexperienced and that sort of thing, it can be kind of a tough transition. And I'll admit, for me, I was fresh out of the classroom, and it did end up being a bit of a rough transition. One con is a leadership bottleneck. So you have one person making decisions on a variety of things. So, if your superintendent is bogged down with negotiations and complaints and dealing with public meetings, if he's also your MTS coordinator, your 504 coordinator, like some of those tasks might get pushed down the line as he gets one task done. Now, in particular, there are things as a principal and a superintendent that can conflict, negotiations being a good one there. I'll get more into that later. But since all the decisions are flowing through one point, it's easier for that to get a cog in it, a plug in it. Disruption of the chain of command. So if, in my example, if you have an issue with the 504 coordinator and he is the principal and the superintendent, you pretty much have to have an express lane to make a complaint to the board. There isn't really steps to go through because you're all the people in that chain. And so you'll have to manage that differently. Sometimes you need to work around it or put procedures in place, but something to keep in mind. Alluded to this before, but competing responsibilities. Principal, for example, manages quite a bit of the day-to-day. It's going to take on the discipline issues, those things that need immediate attention, where a lot of the superintendent duties are more long-range planning, communication with the public, and you're going to have to prioritize. And so some of those duties going to be done not as well as you would like. And sometimes that can be difficult, but it's necessary. It can be very difficult for the administrator to be gone. This should be pretty obvious. Like if you have one person who's your trained administrator and they're gone, something happens at the school, who makes a decision? Now, this can be handled through chain of command policies and identifying perhaps a very strong teacher that can take charge while you're gone. But in my experience, that can be kind of difficult, not best scenario, because they need to teach, they need to be in the classroom. Sometimes a position like a counselor might work fairly well because they don't have a classroom instruction element, or it's not a bigger part of their position. But in particular with the principal, that person really needs to be available in case something comes up, and stuff tends to come up. That can happen with a superintendent too, but that's generally a little different nature and probably not as frequent as with the principal, but that depends. And like I said, excellent time management skills. Like you'll see later in the slide that managing a wide variety of things that are dissimilar has a particular tax on your ability to keep things straight and organized. And so you really want somebody that's strong with that, but keep in mind that somebody who it's more than your average organizational skills is what I'm trying to say. It might require more than just basic competencies. But what is it like? Being a dual role administrator is a fast-paced position. It's always interesting as things are always coming up, and you'll never get bored, and you'll learn a lot about a variety of things, and that can be very interesting. But it could be feeling very much like this picture is implying, a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde feeling, where you feel like you're being pulled in different directions. And when you put this hat on, you got to act in this way, and when you put that hat on, you got to act this way. And typically, if you were a dual role administrator, you're probably working in a small community, and so it can be difficult to pretty much always be representing this school, to always have people looking at you through that lens of what it is you do. And that kind of leads me into the next slide here. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the term decision fatigue. It's going to happen with teaching, it's going to happen with administration, but I feel like it's particularly prominent when you're a dual role administrator, and I'll explain why here. But first, so what it is, this test where you put your hand in cold water, what it is they see how long you can keep your hand in there before you pull it out. Basically, exercising willpower. It's designed as a willpower measurement. And so these researchers took people, and they had one group make a lot of decisions and put their hand in there, and they actually measured the impact that had on their ability to exercise their willpower. They weren't able to keep their hand in the cold water as long when they had to make a lot of decisions. So how that comes into play with a dual role administrator is that you're going to have to make a lot of decisions about what gets your time today. You're going to have to make a lot of decisions about which is the bigger priority. Are you going to get this task done or that task? If you take some look at people that are dealing with poverty, and this obviously isn't a severe scenario, but that decision of are you going to buy soap or have food can be particularly taxing or stressing. And so the number of decisions you have to make are a lot, and they're varied, and you have to deal a lot specifically with that type of question of this or this, what takes precedent, even though like I probably need both are important, but that ability to sort through those types of decisions. And I find one of the difficult things when you are a dual role administrator is like a normal position has kind of ebbs and flows. There's certain times of the year, such as with a superintendent, January, a bunch of reports, financial reports come out, and you're reorganizing the board and different things, and so you're a little bit more busy. Well, a principal is very busy when the school year starts and at the end of the year with reporting and when evaluations need to be done. And so like that ebb and flow can be more constant. You never really get a chance to slow down and think. And sometimes you almost have to make a conscious effort to like think about, is what I'm doing something that makes sense? Or am I just doing it because I'm used to doing it, because I know it's expected of me, but I'm not really, thinking about it. And sometimes that can result in not making as effective decisions as we could because we just don't slow down and we don't notice things. So as I said, organization is essential, not optional. And any administrative position is going to require organization. But let me explain why I think in a dual role administrative position that is particularly challenging. You take a look over there at the two lists: banana, apple, pineapple, grape, blueberry, banana, square, bank, rocket, 8, which is easier to remember. Those of you who are educators probably know the answer to that the first list, all those things are fruit. So in your mind, you can categorize them as fruit, and it's easier to remember the list because they all have some sort of similarity. The second list, there's no rhyme or reason to it, and so it's more difficult to remember the individual parts. And I feel like that's the biggest challenge with being organized when you're a dual role administrator. A lot of times you have many varied tasks that are dissimilar. And so I was a fairly organized art teacher, but I really struggled when I shifted into a K-12 building principal position because I was having trouble juggling the more than 3 or 4 balls that I was normally used to. And I was a teacher that had like a lesson plan for a snow day and backup lessons, and very detailed about what the intent of my lesson is and the resources I need. But those skills did not prepare me for the level of organization I needed when I moved into a dual administrative role. And just to be honest with you for now, that was I went through a period of my life where everything around me felt like a hurricane. I was trying to get organization in the midst of chaos. My personal life started suffering. My mental health started suffering. I actually had the dentist concerned for me for a while because I was grinding teeth in my sleep, and he told me if I didn't stop that I'd need to get special mouth guard in order to address it. And I was just finding myself wholly unprepared to have the skill sets to manage all this stuff going on. And fortunately, my superintendent sent me to some training from the Principal Center, and I got some very specific training on organization, and that was very helpful. Some of the features of that really helped me was organizing by due date. So instead of organizing by, this is what I do for PD, this is what I do as budget, this is what I do, etc. When you're a dual role administrator, that's a pretty long list. And like the banana square bank rocket, they're not really that similar. So trying to remember what it is you need to accomplish in a day, it's adding those extra decisions onto. So you're increasing the fatigue from the example before with the water. You're also increasing the cognitive load. So let me pause there for a sec. But one thing to keep in mind, there's no real thing known as multitasking. What your brain does is it puts a little tab into the thought, and it keeps it back there while you do another task. And then when you go back to the first task, it pulls it back out. So it requires a part of your mental energy. So when you're multitasking, you can't give the other thing that you're working on your true full attention. What you're really doing is alternating between the two. And that's very tempting when you have a dual administrative role. This rapidly switch between tasks, and then it's easy to kind of lose things in the mix. And so doing things to alleviate the amount of times you have to rapidly switch between tasks and switch between dissimilar tasks will really help you with your organization. One strategy I found pretty effective was I would block off time, and during that time, I would only work on, say, writing up evaluations or scheduling or budgets. And obviously things could come up and emergencies could arise, but like I would make it a priority to work on these tasks, and I would try to group them by like some sort of similarity with them. And I would spend like an hour on them. Because before, when I was trying to deal with the hurricane and under all that stress, like, email can be very dangerous. You jump from one thing and you read somebody sending an email about this topic, so you go down that thread, and then you get another one, and that goes somewhere else, and pretty soon you have a bunch of started tasks that are half done. So I'm not saying do away with open door policies or never to do a meeting on the spot, but do protect your time. And often what I would tell people is if you really want my full attention, so I'm not trying to keep track of something else I need to get done while I'm talking to you, make an appointment, I'll block it off on my schedule, and you'll get my full attention. And most people understood why I wanted to do that. So at the end of the day, you can't do it all. Just keep that in mind. And that was one thing from my training that was really helpful, was understanding that nobody's a Superman, nobody's a Wonder Woman. These struggles of keeping track of things, of organizing, needing to write down, common to any administrative position, but like I said, particularly taxing for these reasons I gave you in a dual role. But we all struggle, and accepting that that wasn't something unique to me, that wasn't something that I just struggled with, that other people did, was very helpful. One other person that can be pretty helpful in keeping you organized is your school secretary. A lot of times I would have her take phone calls and see what a person wanted. So if they really needed me, it'd go through. If it was like, say, I'm mad about a grade, redirect to a teacher, or if it was about athletic schedules, to the athletic coordinator. so that so it's protecting my time a little bit more. And so she could reroute people to the right places, and I didn't need to be spending time doing that. So working with your secretary, very important. A lot of times I would share my day-to-day schedule. And so if she did have somebody come in who really wanted to meet, she could let them know what a time was, and we could organize that rather than get pulled this way and that way. And like I said, in the process, kind of lose track of what you're doing. So like I've been saying with this, prioritizing and delegating becomes essential. And that's true of any administrative position, but like within your job description, you might have to think about what are the most important things within that job descriptions, those two job descriptions or more. Some of us have more than just two titles, but you might have to say, like, I really am going to prioritize getting into classrooms. And so you're going to need to block off time, but I'm not going to do this report as well as I would like, but I will get it done, and being mentally cognizant that you're doing those things. So, because something that people often don't realize when a district is declining or has smaller enrollment numbers is that the amount of your student population doesn't directly correlate with how much work your administrator has to do. Just because the number of students decline, and the same is true in a classroom, just because you go from 20 to 15 doesn't always necessarily translate to a significant difference in workload, depending on what it is. So moving on to the next slide. So here are some more specifics, in particular when you're combining a principal or similar position with a superintendent position. First thing you need to make sure that you answer the question to is, what is the contract going to look like? It's most common to see both the superintendent and principal positions rolled up into one. However, you might want to separate them if you don't want one position tied to the other. So an example for that would be like you wouldn't want your superintendent / principal to necessarily need to resign in order to become a full-time superintendent, because he would be given up the principal title. So like considering, is this a temporary thing or a long-term thing? As a person who fulfills a dual role, I did appreciate combined contracts because, like, it was easier to keep track of the language, how much how many leave days I had and how much I could accumulate, and that sort of stuff was easier to keep track of. I do want to specifically recommend that, and for any administrator, to not reference the teacher master contract. I've seen times where a district will reference the teacher's negotiated agreement, master contract, and there's different statutes that regulates those positions, and they don't always jive with the procedures that might be in the master contract. And your administrators don't negotiate the teacher contract. In particular, your superintendent, who's most likely sitting on the other side of the table negotiating with your educational staff. So I think that's important. Make sure you lay that out. You will want to think of how you're going to handle chain of command positions in particular, because those are two very high level positions. And so when you have an issue with your principal, there's really no spot above it. You go from the principal to the superintendent. And so I do recommend being very careful with your policies, reviewing them. So what's your grievance procedure? You don't want those methods of complaining to become a way to get at your principal or superintendent by like just kind of streamlining complaints directly to your board and not having a way to address those. Obviously, if you have legitimate complaints, you need to deal with them. I'm just saying, when there isn't that checks and balances, there's no supervisor directly in charge. That kind of puts more pressure on your board chair, which is really important for a dual role administrator to have a good relationship with their board chair. And this chain of command issue is one of them. So not only should your administrator be strong, but your board chair should be strong as well. Evaluations, what is that going to look like? Obviously, your superintendent can't evaluate themselves on how they do as a principal. In North Dakota, they didn't recommend the board evaluate the principal position, but in Minnesota, that's a little different. But you might want some things in place to better inform you, because most of you probably are not familiar with what the principal is doing day to day, what their training entails, the things they're handling. You don't necessarily see everything. And it's not necessarily something you have a lot of direct experience in. Now, what I did in the 10 years that I was doing the dual role positions was I do staff surveys based on like a Marzano rubric or some sort of principal competencies. But if you do that, and with any survey, design the questions very carefully. Don't ask, does the principal spend enough time in the classroom? Does he put enough of his energy into curriculum? Is he effective with discipline? Those are relevant questions, do not get me wrong. However, those are very subjective the way they're worded, and you're very likely to get more of an opinion and feelings on how they feel about the administrator rather than some concrete information. So asking how often the administrator visits with the teacher, how quickly they address discipline, like putting a hard fact on that. So my administrator visits with me 4 times a year, 2 times a year, once a year, never. Discipline issues are generally handled within 48 hours, 24 hours, a week. Seems like never, whatever the case is, just put some thought into how those are worded. I also recommend you put somebody in charge of collecting the surveys. Understandably, teachers can be uncomfortable answering the survey to their administrator, even if they put in procedures in the Google Doc to, so that people are anonymous, so that people don't have to worry about that. But then your administrator doesn't really have a way to check who filled out the survey, who's completed it. If you put a secretary or somebody of a similar position in charge of that, they can make sure everybody returns the survey and make sure that you get good feedback. Because what happened to me a few of the years was I'd maybe get 3, 4, 5 responses, and I had more than double the amount of staff that survey was given to. And so what generally happens in situations like that is you hear back from people that maybe have an axe to grind, that are unhappy about something. It's not very, it's not a full picture. And so you're not necessarily getting a good idea of what kind of work they're doing. You might be just getting an idea of how the person they had to reprimand or put on a plan of improvement feels about them. So along that lines, also be careful with open-ended questions. Don't have anything against it, but word them carefully. And be aware of what sort of information you're going to get and take things with a grain of salt. Sometimes even within a negative comment or an unconstructive one, to be more precise, there might be some nuggets of truth that you can grow with. You just sometimes have to shift through things that maybe aren't so constructive. But with that, to keep in mind, typically you're in a small school, so a lot of us have like 7-member boards, so it's not atypical for somebody on the board to have some sort of relation to somebody on staff. So like one of your board members may be the spouse of a teacher. If your superintendent is in charge of evaluating that particular person, that can create some serious conflicts of interest and some tension. Can make the administrator feel like they really can't discipline this particular person. Or if they do, they can feel like they're going to take retaliation. And as much as we like to deny it, that sort of stuff does happen. So you would have seen this a little bit in that survey that I shared with you. And there's usually differences, and this is true for any administrator, but I think it's important to manage it when you're a dual role administrator. There's a difference between what people think you're spending your time on and what you should be spending your time on. Teachers, for example, they're going to think you're spending about 50-50 time is what would be typically expected. But Administrators a lot of time report they spend more time on the principal duties because it needs to be addressed right now. The discipline issue needs to be dealt with right now. The emergency needs to be dealt with now. I'm sure you're sensing the theme there. Like not everything can wait, and your principals do a lot of things to make sure operations go well, to keep discipline in line, and those things pull their energy away. And your administrators will report they would like more time to be spending on educational leadership, mentoring, fostering the teachers, the staff there, because obviously when you're combining administrative supervisory roles, the number of people that you have to provide feedback, you have to watch, grows quite a bit. And with those competitions of time, it can be too tempting to not give like evaluations your full attention. And generally people like staff anyway aren't going to be too concerned that maybe you're not getting every single one of your evaluations done, as they're going to be more concerned about that discipline since that directly affects them. That's their concern. That's what's important to them. But so with a dual role, you probably have a lot of miscellaneous job titles, and a lot of people might not necessarily understand that you're also editing the school website, that you're doing this report, that the reason that you're not around today is because you have to do these duties that are specific to your superintendency. And people might not see why you're doing certain things to prioritize one task over another. This was really important to them. This was their problem, and you're not getting it done. Therefore, you're not attentive to their needs. You're not responsive as administrator. So my recommendation is be very open with people like, hey, this is what I'm prioritizing. These things, I will get them done, but I don't have time to give them my full attention. These things I'm going to give my full attention, do my best with, but like these things, because of the things I need to get done, are not going to be a priority for me. They're going to need to wait. Really communicating that with your board and your staff, I think, is important. So they understand why, like the rhyme or reason to how things are getting done when they're getting done. And that can alleviate a lot of tension that might grow out of not really knowing the answers to that or making assumptions that don't reflect a reality there. So let's pause for a minute, take a look at those first 4 statements you wrote down. Do you have things you didn't expect to learn? So just pause the slideshow and we'll continue in a minute. And so kind of getting a little bit into maybe more of the struggles that a dual role administrator might face, but being an administrator is inherently isolating, and in a small rural community is definitely true, regardless of if it's a dual administrative role. However, by definition, if you're combining administrative roles, there's not as many administrators to go around. And so you might be in a situation where you don't have a colleague that has something similar they're dealing with. You don't have somebody else to bounce off of that really understands what you're going through, at least in-house. So I think it's very important to develop a good network. And the caveat of this is that, you know, anybody who is being a dual role administrator has that same challenge of time restraints, many and varied roles, difficulty of getting away from their building. Fortunately, in this day and age, you have the benefit of technology like you're watching now. So that can help you have a meeting where you don't have to be physically gone and connect with somebody. I had a mentor when I became an elementary principal and a superintendent, retired. The previous retired superintendent, and that was very helpful because I had somebody to go talk to, share what was going on, somebody that understood the problems I was dealing with and could be a sounding board. And that can be difficult to find. So one of the things that happens when you have very few administrative roles and you have a lot of the high-level decision titles is that you're very much the face of the school. And, you know, no matter where you go, if you're the administrator, you're going to be the face of the school. But like, particularly in a small community where you have all the decisions running through you, you know, how that person feels about the school is probably going to be how they feel about you. And you most likely have some sort of connection with a spouse, a student. You interact with somebody. So it can be kind of hard to find those connections outside of school. You know, finding somebody that you're comfortable hanging out with, so to speak, and that's part of the feeling of isolation. However, with the decision-making part, it's also very important to be very transparent with what you're doing with that, because if people begin to distrust you, begin to associate you with things that they're not happy with the school, that can start to be reflected on your character, on your personality, and it might not always be justified or warranted, but you're the school to everybody. And so because of that leadership bottleneck, everybody is going to associate the decisions with you. Most likely they have to run through you. Now, one way to combat that last thing I brought up is to develop means of collaboration, ways to gather input from a variety of people. For example, I formed a hiring committee, and admittedly, part of the initial reasoning for that was I caught a little flack on some questionable hires because, I only had one applicant, and that's what I had to work with. So we tried and ran into some difficulties. A lot of us out here are facing that right now, where there's just not applicants involved. But anyway, when I formed the committee, they got to see that I was only dealing with one applicant, or a lot of times it came to the same decision. But the really important thing that came out of it was they saw what I was doing, what was going into it. We actually formed a PD around some of those concepts. We had early outs where we had committee meetings, and I did things like collaborative, where I'd meet with different people and get their input and really invite people to give me feedback, be very transparent, communicate. This is how I'm doing it. This is why I'm doing it. And that was really, it's a good strategy as leadership just in general. It also puts less of it shares the responsibility more. Like, since I didn't have necessarily an administrative team, like a team of administrators, like I might have had lead teachers, but I didn't have those people that naturally share the decision making with me. So if somebody was unhappy with what happened, it was going to be with me. Buck stops there. Again, true of any administrative position. But like I said, so many of the decisions are running through you that they can feel very heavy. And I found a good way to handle a little bit of that is to share the decision making, put in processes, and to really communicate why you're doing something, to really let people know that these are the facts of the matter. This is why we did it. Doesn't mean they need to agree, but so that they feel like they understand, I guess. And inviting people can also help you with your stress and your managing multiple and varied things. And it's a part of delegation. Just highly recommend it. Remember to take care of yourself. And good transition into this slide. So beware of piling on. So it's a natural phenomena in psychology, but a lot of times we are tempted to keep giving tasks to those people that we know are going to get them done. And then we tend to not give tasks to people that we don't trust to get things done. So this creates situations where, particularly in a small school where you have people that need to wear multiple hats in order to get different miscellaneous things done, where you have a certain group of people that have pretty much all the extra duties, the extra assignments, and things like that. And you have other people that, for lack of a better way to put it, have more of the bare minimum, and people don't really want to ask them more because they can't count on them to get it done. So what this has to do with a person who's specifically in a dual administrative role is that it can be very tempting to basically just keep saying yes. Sure, I'll do this. Sure, I'll do that. Maybe don't want to put that on to somebody else because everybody else's plate's pretty full, or maybe you don't trust such and such person to get it done. It does go back to delegating. It might not get done the way you want to, but sometimes you need other people to do things, even if they don't get done to the same quality as you would like. But sometimes we find it easier to just do things ourselves than to ask somebody else to do it. And one thing with an administrative position is that we don't have a real set schedule. So it's always kind of funny when the reporting came around where I had to report how much time I was spending on being a 504 coordinator, being a transportation coordinator. Because quite honestly, I probably had a 50, 60 hour day or a week. And like I was reporting on 40. So, I kind of fudged numbers to get them to work in the thing because it didn't really allow you to report all the extra time you were putting in. That can very easily happen. And like I said, you can feel like you have to do it, like that you need to be Wonder Woman, Superman. Because if you go back to that feeling of isolation and that responsibility that I was talking about, you can also feel like that you need to hold everything up, that you need to do that or things aren't going to hold together. You need to do those things or bad things are going to happen. My wife often joked with me when we were driving by the schools I led during those dual role positions and said, see, the school didn't burn down just because you were gone for a day. And so, yeah, that sense that you can't be gone and you need to handle things personally can kind of be inhibiting, can kind of make you not see things that you need to address. So I kind of mentioned it before, but like my recommendation, if you are filling a dual role, is to make sure you do take time where you stop and reflect, that you stop just trying to keep up on the treadmill. I know that's harder said than done, and kind of reflect like, is this workload that I'm doing reasonable? Can somebody else do this? Do we need to reassess these job assignments? I know when I was working in Munich, it came to one point at a board meeting where people were very concerned about transportation schedules, and there was trouble with getting them done, getting them out, and I just flat out said, I can't do it. The business manager was in the same boat as me, having many job titles. We don't have time for it. Like, if you want this to get done, you're going to have to hire a part-time person, because it's not my biggest priority, because these things are my priority. And they did end up hiring a part-time person. But my point in that story is, I really feel like if you're going to fill that role, you need to be comfortable advocating for yourself. You need to be comfortable telling people you have too much going on, somebody else needs to do this. You need to be comfortable saying, hey, here's a task, can you do it? And being able to say no and not fall into that martyr symptoms that we sometimes do as educators. That we need to suffer so that everybody sees how important we are. That's really a roundabout way, a way of feeding our own ego and inflating how important we are. So just be careful of that. And, just good advice if you are administrator or board, looking at job duties that, can be tempting to give your best employees more and more work to do because they get it done. And you don't see the problems that go with it. You don't see the things they need to do. A good example of that was one time I was interviewed by a paper about a teacher shortage. This was prior to the pandemic, and we were certainly struggling then too. And I told them about the challenges, and that appeared in the paper. And I remember catching flack from some of my board members. They're like, oh, you're making our school sound awful. Like, we can't hire people. Like, nobody wants to work here. And I was like, no, this is what I'm dealing with. This is the challenges I have. So it's very important to communicate those and help people understand what it is that you're struggling with, what you're going through. And sometimes having that vulnerability and saying that you're not Superman or Wonder Woman can be hard for some of us. But it's a part of that transparency and that honesty, being honest about what you can take on, about what you can handle. And ultimately, it's for your mental health. So like, you can't be burning a candle at both ends and be useful to the people around you. And sometimes you need to tell people, I'm burning the candle at two ends. I can't keep this up. I need help. And that's okay. So this has been a dual administrative roles. What is it like presentation? I hope you found it useful. I hope I answered some questions that you had and maybe gave you some information that you didn't expect. So there are definitely pros to being a dual administrator. It's exciting, fast-paced. You still stay close to the students. You get involved in things. But there's definitely cons. You have to manage a wide range of things, many and varied things, and that requires some different time management skills. It puts a lot of load on you mentally. It's cheaper, and you don't need to find as many people. And I think we can all agree right now it's really hard to find good people, and so that can be tempting to just work with the ones you have. And sometimes that is the best way to go, because I've certainly been a part of situations where I hired somebody that was perhaps more work to make sure that things were going well than it was to just do the job myself. But to be careful that you're not asking your administrator to pile on and setting him up in a situation where he's not going to meet the expectation because he has too many things going on and he can't get them done. Or that you're an administrator that gets into a position where you've taken on too much. You need to be able to tell people that it is too much, be able to articulate why, and employ some strategies maybe to address it yourself a little bit. But there is my email, there is my phone number at Long Prairie. Feel free to scoot me a question if you had some. Hope you found this useful. Have a good day. Take care.